This is the Living in Mid-Bloom podcast, lighthearted and heartfelt conversations about what it looks like to live, heal, and blossom in middle age. I'm your host, April Pruitt. Let's get our bloom on. Hi, mid-bloomers. Hey, friends. What's going on? Did you have a good couple of weeks? And can you believe it is May? And time is just flying by. Now, here's another question. Are all your feelings present and accounted for? Of course, that's the name of my podcast. And I think it's a good question. I ask this of myself almost every day. Do I stay in the moment? Can I respond in real time? Am I depriving myself of certain feelings because they're painful? And I say deprive because whatever that feeling is, it's so important to acknowledge it as quickly as you can. Otherwise, and I know, it becomes a burden and something that still has to be dealt with. But I'm getting better over time. And of course, it's usually stressful situations that I tend to step out of myself, which is not a good thing. But I am finding through my podcast that there are moments or relationships that I'm continuing to heal from as I talk about them and start to really feel them and embrace them. In this episode, I talk about emotional difficulties and trust with family relationships and trust relationships with those whose role is to support us. Please do not listen to this episode if you believe any of these subjects may trigger you. The contents of this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek guidance from your healthcare professional. The names of individuals and locations mentioned in this episode have been changed in order to protect everyone's privacy. My thoughts about finding the right therapist are my own personal point of view and not to be considered as advice from a professional. So again, thinking back to the title of this episode, All Feelings Present and Accounted For, but then I think, what about feelings you were not allowed to have? If I think about my childhood, I know that I was not allowed to be angry, especially as a girl, and I tucked it all inside. And I was also not allowed to cry. Though you end up crying, you're crying and they're saying, don't cry or stop crying. I remember this. We had a break-in into our house. I was like 6 or 7, and the house was just destroyed. And that scared me. And then seeing the reactions of my family, I started crying. I hear my dad ask my mom, why is she crying? And then neither of them consider comforting me. You know, at that age, I'm confused. And again, you just kind of tuck the feeling aside. So, I've thought about this for years about the whole crying thing. I think part of it, again, it's just a guess that maybe my dad was feeling that he wasn't protecting me and was upset about it and didn't know how to show it. I don't know. It's a guess. I know our parents are doing the best they can with what they have. And I'm just grateful that I'm curious about this stuff. I want to dig around in it. And you start thinking about the people in your life that are there to support you, to be there for your benefit. Your real estate agent, your attorney, your doctor, your therapist, your broker, your kids' teachers. The point is, nothing is black or white. Wouldn't life be so much easier if I could just point to someone, you're bad, you're good, you're good, you're bad. No, we have to have relationships and we have to take the time to understand who people are and try to be as honest and present as we can in our lives. But that's just not always the case. And I know a lot of cases where I wasn't present. And then 10 years later, I'm like, hey, wait a minute, you screwed me over. That's the reality of it all. And when I mentioned in my last episode about my anger toward my therapist because she supported that manager saying he wanted to include me in his book. I mean, I point out maybe the one thing that upset me when I do have to say that this woman was very good to me, helped me tremendously, especially with some issues I had been unaware of until she brought some things to my attention. So it's important to me to say that. But I also have the right to express how I felt, and I did. So now I'm also saying how much she's helped me, and I'll go into that. Okay, so last week, or my last episode, I had said that I would not talk about another therapist that done me wrong. But there is a positive from this negative. So the therapist that I mentioned that knew that manager, okay, I was working with her and she had asked me about the previous therapist and she said, oh, is she a licensed social worker or a psychologist? And I said, yes, she's a social worker. And she asked me, have I ever checked like any records or anything? And I thought, why is she asking me this? She knows something I don't know. So I say, is there a way I can check on someone? And she told me how. And I checked and I found that this person had not been licensed for at least 7 years and did not do any of her continuing education. I was stunned about this. And as I look at this, I think, okay, I was with that therapist for like 18 years. I can't even believe that I was with her that long. But again, it's another learning curve, a real curve. So, and of course, I will continue on to that story for next time. But I also want to leave you with a tip. And surprise, it's about checking your therapist's credentials to make sure that they're licensed, that they have a good track record, that there aren't complaints, because I know for a licensed social worker, you can check to see if there were any issues or complaints. And then also you can find out if they're up to date with their education. I mean, if they're not licensed, they're not up to date. That takes care of that. So I leave you on a interesting note here, but the issue of just having your feelings and recognize the importance of them. When you're little and small, all you know is that someone tells you can't do this, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. And that kind of sticks with you until you finally figure out that, okay, they weren't right, but they didn't know either. They can't give you something they don't have. So I leave you with that. Nothing's black or white. That makes life complicated. It makes life interesting, though. All right. Goodbye, my mid-bloomers. Thank you for joining me today on Living in Mid-Bloom. I hope you found this episode insightful, meaningful, and maybe it's given you something to think about. I invite you to share your positive reviews or ideas on topics you would like me to touch on by leaving your comments on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, Podchaser, or Podcast Addict. We are all divine beings who just want to be seen, heard, and loved. Have a beautiful day.